What's going on, guys? It's Danny from Fantasy Stock Exchange here, and today I'll be going through my Week 17 wide receiver rankings in the tier list format we've done these past couple months, where I basically break down my top 30 wide receivers, who the guys that I expect to be elite this week, wide receiver ones, wide receiver twos, or wide receiver 2-3 archetypes entering your championship week this week. Again, if you've made it this far, congrats, but there's still work to do. You still have to make sure you're the top dog in your league. And it's my job this week to help prepare you for your guys' championship. So if you're new to this series, basically I break down usage, tiers, again, like I mentioned, the elite guys, wide receiver ones, etc. there, and critical game information such as spreads, betting trends, all of that good stuff that you guys need to help set your wide receiver lineups this week. Again, this is crunch time. You need these wins. You need to be that top dog in your league, and it's my job to help prepare you to do so. So if you guys enjoy, make sure you leave a like down below. Comment your biggest start-sit decision. I'll try to get to as many as possible given how crucial it is this week. And of course, subscribe to the channel. We're on the road to 20,000 subscribers as always. I appreciate you guys for that continued support. Before we get into the video, as always, we're going to hit the damn intro. All right, before I get into the official rankings, just want to give a quick preface to the giveaway we have over here at the Fantasy Stock Exchange ending on Sunday this week. If you guys go over and sign up and deposit on Underdog Fantasy using promo code FSC, 5 winners will be chosen for $50 in on-site credits. Plus, of course, if you aren't familiar, this is your first time deposit, you will get a 100% deposit match up to $100. Potential chance to walk away with $150 for signing up and using that to enter some playoff best ball contests, your gauntlets, your mittens, all of that fun stuff to potentially win some more money. So contest ends this Sunday. Make sure you go sign up. Use our code to be entered for a potential free $50 on on-site credit. But moving on to the video, now we go through the matchup chart like we do every single week. And so as you guys can see, the easiest matchups this week happen to be the Chicago Bears going up against the Detroit Lions, the Arizona Cardinals going up against the Atlanta Falcons, and the Tampa Bay Buccaneer wide receivers going up against the Carolina Panthers. On the flip side this week, the toughest matchups, according to the chart, happen to be the Kansas City Chiefs wide receivers going up against the Denver Broncos, the Seattle Seahawks wide receivers going up against that vaunted Jets secondary, and then finally the Los Angeles Rams receivers going up against the Los Angeles Chargers. Now we go on to the shadow matchups, and the expected shadow matchups this week, according to PFF's Ian Hartitz, happen to be Patriots wide receiver Devontae Parker going up against Dolphins cornerback Xavier Howard, Tyreek Hill going up against Jonathan Jones, Darius Slayton going up against Stephon Gilmore, Michael Pittman going up against Fabian Moreau of the New York Giants, Terry McLaurin going up against Denzel Ward, Devontae Adams going up against Charvarius Ward, Mike Williams going up against Jalen Ramsey, and then finally Jamar Chase going up against Bills cornerback Tre'Davious White. But moving off the shadows, now we get into the will they play tier. Basically, every week we kind of mentioned the questionable guys going into Sunday. Will they play? Won't they play? Try to get as much context, as much information as possible as to who may be sitting out this week. Starting that off is Christian Watson of the Green Bay Packers. He did not practice on Thursday with his hip injury, and he is very unlikely to suit up this week. As we'll get into with his teammate Alan Lazard, I am moving forward expecting that Christian Watson will not play in this game on Sunday. Broncos wide receivers with Judy and Courtland Sutton dealing with various injuries. For Judy, it's that ankle injury. With Sutton, that is that hamstring injury. Both were limited in practice on Wednesday, and barring any setbacks, they'll most likely play against Kansas City this week. If they do play, Judy is a top 20-ish level play, while Sutton is a top 30-ish level play. Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks suffered a broken finger 2 weeks ago against the San Francisco 49ers. He did return to practice in limited fashion on Thursday. However, I do believe he is a true question mark. Again, it's 2 weeks removed from that surgery, but he would be a start, in my opinion, a top 30 play if he does suit up this week, given the level of upside we've seen from Lockett when he's been on the field. Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints limited in practice on Wednesday and Thursday with his hamstring injury. He could play in Week 17. Not really much clarification as to how he's recovering fully from that hamstring injury. We'll have more information on to whether he suits up Friday, Saturday, you name it, prior to game time. If he does suit up, he is a clear top 20 wide receiver in my rankings. And then finally, Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers logged a limited session in Thursday's practice. However, 49ers beat seems to think he will miss this contest. However, if he does suit up, I do consider him as a top 24 wide receiver play. But moving off the will they play tier, I move on to the elite wide receivers for me this week. The 6 wide receivers I do think have a leg up on the rest of the receivers on this week's slate. Number one wide receiver for me this week, and basically the number one wide receiver for me any week, is going to be Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. Vikings 3.5 point road underdogs against Green Bay this week. 48 set over under, with the under being hit 51% of the time. And with Justin Jefferson, it's pretty easy to see why he's my wide receiver one. There's a high over under game environment, 11.6 targets per game for Justin Jefferson, and arguably the top wide receiver talent in the entire NFL. That's a level of legendary season that Justin Jefferson is having right now. Not to mention, this is the same team that he scored 39.4 PPR points against in week one with the Green Bay Packers secondary. There's still incentive for Minnesota to keep the starters in, with Justin Jefferson, of course, pursuing that 2,000-yard season, an NFL record, and Minnesota fending off San Francisco for that 2 seed in the NFC. Congrats on your championship if you do have Justin Jefferson, because I do think this is a week where you could see 15 targets. You can see, 10 receptions, 200 yards, maybe a couple scores in this game. He has that level of upside, that level of ceiling anytime he is playing. And I don't think anything is different entering this week against the Green Bay Packers. Wide receiver 2 for me this week is going to be Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. 6-point home favorites versus Chicago. 52 set over 60% of the time in terms of betting trends. And with Amon-Ra St. Brown, it's pretty easy to see why I have him up here. Any game he's played 50+% of the snaps this year, he averages 19.94 PPR points per game. With Detroit, they have a very favorable matchup against Chicago this week. And with Amon-Ra St. Brown, 22.1 PPR points in the last outing Detroit played against Chicago Bears. I expect an absolute score fest in this game. Chicago to be putting pressure on the other end, Detroit to be putting up numbers on their end, and for Amon-Ra St. Brown to be the league winner this week, maybe a 10 reception line. He's been that level of consistent since entering this Detroit Lions offense. Wide receiver 3 for me this week is going to be Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. 1-point home underdogs against the Buffalo Bills this week. 49.5 set over under 89% of the time. And with the Bengals, they are implied for 24 points this week. But when it comes to Jamar Chase specifically, 19.98 PPR points per game in the games he's been healthy this year. I expect this to be a super high scoring game environment. Obviously, Bills, Bengals, both fighting for that high placement in the AFC playoff picture. And I do think that Cincinnati and Buffalo, respectively, are going to be putting up points on either end. And speaking of that, I can just transition to my wide receiver 4, Stephon Diggs, the flip side of this matchup. I get it. He has struggled in the last few games, but he's still averaging 19.55 PPR points per game this season on about 10 targets per game. I already mentioned, again, the game environment when I discussed Chase. We expect both teams to be putting up points, maybe a 34-31 type of game environment with Allen and Burrow duking it out. Ultimately here, I'm trusting Diggs to be able to step away from his recent, micro game struggles, because from a macro perspective, we are still getting a 10 target per game player catching passes from Josh Allen in this Buffalo Bills high octane offense. So yeah, I mean, you just kind of live with the highs and lows sometimes at the wide receiver position. Obviously, Stephon Diggs has gone through his lows, but I do think this is the get right week for Stephon Diggs in this Bills offense. Wide receiver 5 already played on Thursday night with CeeDee Lamb. If you guys already have him in your lineup, he put up 21 PPR points, a very solid outing, 11 receptions, 100 yards, failed to score, which, you wish to see happen. But ultimately, if you have CeeDee Lamb in your lineup, you are very, very happy with this Thursday night showing. Wide receiver 6 for me this week is going to be A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. 6.5-point home favorites versus New Orleans this week. 42 set over 98% of the time. And we'll know more about his possibility to play this week later today, I'm assuming. But Thursday was designated as a rest day for Brown, not an injury day. So that's a very, very key piece of information. Obviously suffered a minor knee injury against the Cowboys last week, was down on the field for a little bit, ended up returning to the game. I don't think this knee injury is going to be an issue. And regardless, I mean, if he does play in this game, we're talking about a 17.8 PPR points per game receiver. And while we do prefer Jalen Hurts to get the start this week, which he may or may not, Gardner Minshew showed that against a good Cowboys defense, he can keep this Eagles pass game afloat. If A.J. Brown does suit up, he's got one of the highest ceilings of any wide receiver on this entire slate, given his yards after catch ability, given his playmaking ability, and obviously that physical nature he brings to the game. So 17.8 PPR points per game, and as we know, any given week, he can blow up for 30 points. But moving off the elite tier, we go on to the wide receiver 1s tier, and hitting that off has been the pinnacle wide receiver 1, if you will, since he's returned from his injury, with Keenan Allen of the Los Angeles Chargers. 6.5-point home favorites versus the Rams this week. 42.5 set over 86% of the time. And Keenan Allen, since returning from injury, like I mentioned, 11 targets per game, 18.1 PPR points per game. you are getting the number one wide receiver for a Justin Herbert-led offense when the Chargers are still fighting for seeding in the AFC playoffs. They want to be that 5 seed. They want to play that AFC South winner. So for the Los Angeles Chargers, each of these last 2 games are must-win territory. This is literally the recipe for a league-winning level ceiling with Keenan Allen, the highest target earner on a Justin Herbert Chargers offense. He's not the sexiest name, I get it. He's not going to, wow you like a CeeDee Lamb, AJ Brown, Jamar Chase type, but I do think that he has an extremely steady wide receiver 1 range of outcome this week. Wide receiver 8 is going to be T. Higgins. I already mentioned the matchup information with Cincinnati and Buffalo, but when it comes to T. Higgins, 17 targets in his last 2 weeks and a touchdown in each of his last 4 games he's been healthy for. Not to mention, if you exclude the games that he hasn't been healthy this year, he averages 17.88 PPR points per game in games that he played 50+% of the snaps. I already mentioned the game environment, of course, with Chase and Diggs, but I do think a ton of points could be scored. And as we know, there's a very concentrated target share on the Cincinnati Bengals. Jamar Chase gets the number 1 load. T. Higgins not too far behind as the wide receiver 2. He's not your typical wide receiver 2. Typical wide receiver 2 would be in that 15 to 24 range, but given the level of volume, given the level of talent over here with T. Higgins, not to mention the offensive insulation with Joe Burrow, with that Cincinnati offense, he is a top 10 level wide receiver, in my opinion, this week. Wide receiver 9 for me this week is going to be Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. 2.5-point road underdogs versus the Patriots this week. The Dolphins are. Everyone set over under with the betting trends not currently being available quite yet. And we know that if Tyreek Hill had his full arsenal ready for him this week, he would rank much higher than my wide receiver 9. But as we know, the big elephant in the room here is how Teddy Bridgewater can keep this offense afloat with Tua out with his concussion. He's a back-end wide receiver 1 for me, which feels about right. Obviously, we know when he's healthy, when Tua is healthy, he is a league winner. He's in that elite tier. But with Teddy at the helm combined with a matchup against a stingy Patriots defense, it does dim his outlook, in my opinion. However, of course, the volume is still clearly there. They're still going to get him involved. As we know, Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle are the engines of this offense. So it's too tough to pass on Tyreek Hill outside of my top 10, despite the lowered ceiling with Tua Tagovailoa being out of the lineup. Wide receiver 10, in a very similar scenario to that of Tyreek Hill missing Tua, we head on to Devontae Adams of the Las Vegas Raiders. Raiders are 9.5-point road underdogs versus San Francisco this week. 42 set over under. Betting trends not currently available quite yet on PFF. And as I mentioned, very similar scenario to that with Tyreek Hill. Only, of course, I trust Teddy Bridgewater in Miami's implied total a lot more than I trust Jarrett Stidham in Vegas's implied points. And with Devontae Adams, I get it. He's been a huge fantasy playoff disappointment thus far, but he still averages over 10 targets per game. He still averages over 19 PPR points per game. And although it is a tough matchup, I'm trusting the volume from Devontae Adams to be able to get his floor in this wide receiver 1 area. Obviously, the ceiling is clearly impacted not having Derek Carr at the helm, but I do think Devontae Adams getting 9, 10, 11 targets is well worth making up for it. Wide receiver 11 for me this week is going to be Garrett Wilson, the rookie wide receiver of the New York Jets. 1.5-point road favorites against Seahawks this week. 42.5 set over under 54% of the time in betting trends. 19.3 PPR points per game this year for Garrett Wilson in games Zach Wilson did not play, including nearly 11 targets per game and 91.5 yards per game. I get it. It's a rookie. You don't want to rank him as a wide receiver 1 already, but he has proven in the 6 games without Zach Wilson that he deserves to be here. And in fact, this is a guy that I can see potentially ascending to the elite tier this time next year. He's very good. He's a very talented separator. He's the clear alpha number 1 target of this team. And the Jets are still fighting for a playoff spot. Mike White's back. This offense should be able to see an uptick in terms of their relative efficiency. And if they're going to get going, if they're going to make a playoff spot, it has to come on the back of Garrett Wilson carrying them there. So I do think this week is the blow-up spot, the get-right spot for Garrett Wilson, a top 12 wide receiver in my rankings. Wide receiver 12 this week is going to be Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. 3-point home favorites versus Carolina this week. A crucial NFC South battle. Could end up being the game that decides whether or not the Tampa Bay Buccaneers or the Carolina Panthers win the division. But 40.5 set over under in this game, over being hit 58% of the time. And with Chris Godwin, I mean, I mentioned Keenan Allen being the epitome of a wide receiver 1. Chris Godwin has been very similar to Keenan Allen, only for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense. A lot of volume, a lot of targets, over 10 targets per game this year for Chris Godwin. And the Panthers, as we kind of saw earlier on, are a top 3 matchup against opposing wide receivers in fantasy this year. Tampa's offense knows they need to take advantage of this Panthers secondary in the passing game, given their inefficient ground attack with Leonard Fournette and Rachaad White really struggling, not to mention the banged up pieces on the offensive line. If Tampa is going to win this game, it has to be on the back of their playmakers. Chris Godwin, Mike Evans. And I do think that Chris Godwin, given his volume, has a much higher range of outcomes than his teammate with Mike Evans. Ceiling hasn't quite been there this year for Godwin, but as I mentioned with Keenan Allen, the floor is just super, super high. Must-win environment, Tom Brady in that type of atmosphere. I expect the target earner on this offense to get a ton of volume. So we made it through our elite wide receivers. We made it through our wide receiver ones. But before we get on to the wide receiver twos, as you guys know, we got to pay some bills over here. You guys should be hearing a word from our sponsors over at Manscaped.
What's happening, y'all? This holiday season, our friends at Manscaped are helping you clear your driveway for safe travels this holiday season. From stocking stuffers to white elephants, Manscaped's products are at the top of every wish list. Win this year's white elephant gift and help all of the men in your life go from eggnog to nice hog this December by going to manscaped.com and using the promo code BUSH at checkout. You will get 20% off plus free shipping. Me and Danny are huge advocates of Manscaped's products, and I'm sure the men in your life will love to get them as Christmas gifts as well. Manscaped is a one-stop shop for all of your holiday needs. They have the perfect gift in the Platinum Package 4.0, plus loads of little presents for stocking stuffers within that package. What a better holiday gift than the gift of good hygiene and probably a couple laughs as well. Manscaped has everything from shampoos, body washes, upstairs and downstairs deodorant, gels, exfoliates, absolutely everything that the men in your life could need to keep them clean this holiday season. Get them a pair of Manscaped boxers as well, specifically made to keep the area of your body cool and provide a holiday comfort year round. And if your dad or your brother or your significant other has nasty nose hairs, save his life with the Weed Whacker nose and ear hair trimmer. The Shears 2.0 is full for nail care with scissors, clippers, tweezers, and a file for the traveling man. There's the new Persevere cologne, which is a light woodsy feel to it, gives that fresh tree scent even after the holidays are over. If the men in your life are still using a loofah, check out the Body Buffer. Loofahs actually hold bacteria from dead skin, help them throw out that disgusting loofah, and get them the body scrubber that helps them feel smoother. And lastly, topping off the stocking with the crown jewel for their family jewels, the Lawnmower 4.0 electric razor, advanced skin-safe technology designed specifically for your downstairs area, known for reducing risks and cuts on his Santa sack. Manscaped is here to make holiday shopping a blast by giving products that they'll love and also giving them a laugh in the process. Again, 20% off plus free shipping using the promo code BUSH at manscaped.com. Whatever the men in your life need for Christmas, Manscaped will have you covered for the perfect gift that will be the biggest holiday hit. Go to manscaped.com, promo code BUSH for 20% off plus free shipping, and we're back to the video.
Now moving on to my wide receiver 2 tier, and you guys can see all the matchup information on the screen, so I'll try to speed run this a little bit faster, but wide receiver 2s, and then following that, of course, the wide receiver 2-3s. Starting off the wide receiver 2s as my wide receiver 13 this week is Mike Williams of the Los Angeles Chargers. And this season, he's averaging about 15.1 PPR points per game. But as we know, he's a very volatile play. The big play, the super high fantasy ceiling is there any given week when it comes to Mike Williams. 4 games this year with over 20 PPR points. I get it. It's a tough matchup on paper with expected shadow coverage from Jalen Ramsey, which is why I prefer Keenan Allen straight up to Mike Williams. But Mike Williams has been extremely efficient on his targets since returning from injury 3 weeks ago. He's got a lower floor than some of the other wide receiver 2s in this range, but I do think that no wide receiver, given current circumstances, has the higher ceiling of Mike Williams in this entire tier. About 25 implied points, Justin Herbert slinging the rock, and about 43 passing attempts per game from Herbert over the course of this year. High volume, high efficient quarterback play from Justin Herbert is a recipe for Mike Williams to legitimately hit the nuts, which is what you need in championship week. Wide receiver 14 is DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks, 1.5 point home underdogs against the Jets this week. 42.5 set over under 54% of the time. And as we know with DK, he's a top talent in this league. 8+ targets in each game since his bye week. He's a PPR wide receiver 13 on the season with 15.3 points per game. The problem that I have with him this week has nothing to do with him himself. This is a matchup against the best cornerback duo in the NFL. Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed have been unbelievable this year. Those two have been locking it down. Top Jets defense en route to being the second toughest matchup against opposing wide receivers all year. He's going to play a lot of his snaps on the outside. We know DJ Reed and Sauce Gardner are absolutely ballers on the outside this year. Nothing will come easy for the Seahawks offense. However, I'm going to trust the volume enough to put DK in my wide receiver 2 range. Wide receiver 15 this week is going to be DeAndre Hopkins of the Arizona Cardinals. 3-point road underdog versus Atlanta this week. 42 set over 78% of the time for Arizona. And when it comes to DeAndre Hopkins, 96 targets in his 9 games played this year. Now facing a Falcons D conceding the second most points to opposing wide receivers. But as we know, the reason why he's wide receiver 15, there is a big problem here. The problem for me, the Cardinals are dysfunctional. The quarterback situation is unsettled, and the implied total for Arizona this week is extremely low. Hopkins has a higher floor than a lot of the other wide receivers in this tier, but I just have no faith that the Cards offense is going to get going in what's been a lost season for them. Again, DeAndre Hopkins, typically a wide receiver one, possibly an elite wide receiver, especially when Kyler Murray is at the helm. But given the current situation he's in, I don't see a league winning level ceiling for Hopkins this week. And as a result, because I don't see that high ceiling, he has to be at the top of my wide receiver 2 range. Next up, wide receiver 16 is Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. I already mentioned the betting information when it came to Tyreek Hill, but I'm basically echoing my notes that I had on Hill when it comes to Jalen Waddle, only that I do think he's more impacted by the quarterback change because he doesn't receive the same type of volume that Tyreek Hill does. Still, however, he's a dynamic playmaker and he can house any single touch in this game given his play style. But I am worried about maybe it's not adequate service from Teddy down the field. Maybe the volume is a little bit down this week with Tyreek Hill, maybe getting 10 to 13 targets. Jalen Waddle more so in that 6 to 8 range. Maybe he doesn't receive that same type of volume that could prop up his floor. And as we know with Teddy Bridgewater compared to Tua Tagovailoa, the ceiling is very diminished comparatively. Wide receiver 17 this week is Juju Smith-Schuster of the Kansas City Chiefs. Chiefs 12.5-point home favorites versus Denver this week. 45 set under 89% of the time. And the reason why I like Juju Smith-Schuster really has less to do with Juju Smith-Schuster as it does to do with the situation, because the Chiefs are implied for 29 total points this week at home against Denver. I get it. Denver is one of the toughest matchups, actually, in fact, the toughest matchup against opposing wide receivers this year. But they really look like they've just packed it in over these last few weeks, especially last week against the Los Angeles Rams. Gave up 51 points in that game. Didn't really look like the same defense like they did earlier in this year. I do think they're susceptible for this Chiefs offense to potentially take advantage of them. And I get it. Juju did disappoint this past week in terms of pure fantasy output. But from a macro perspective, as we know, he is still the wide receiver one for a Mahomes-led offense. It's been a season of ups and downs for Juju with the injuries and the inconsistent play. But I do think that this week is the week he gets back on track. And the Chiefs offense as a whole does get back on track. Wide receiver 18 for me is DJ Moore of the Carolina Panthers. Flip side of that Bucks matchup, 3-point road underdogs versus Tampa Bay. 40.5 set over 58% of the time. And the most underrated story over the last few weeks is the re-emergence of DJ Moore with Sam Darnold at the helm. He's averaging about 15 PPR points per game despite the low volume the Panthers have had due to the run-heavy approach that they have displayed in these last few weeks. Sam Darnold's only attempted about 22 attempts per game, but in this clear pass funnel game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense, obviously, as we know, Tampa Bay good against the run, a little bit more susceptible against the pass. I believe his hot streak and the strong peripherals he's shown continue this week. High target share. If Sam Darnold attempts more than 22 attempts per game, which I would smash the over on, I do think that DJ Moore can return at a top 20, maybe even a fringe top 15 level this week against Tampa Bay. Receiver 19 this week is going to be Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns. 2.5-point road underdogs versus Washington. 40.5 set over 91% of the time. And he's been up and down all year. However, even with those ups and downs, he still averages over 14.2 PPR points per game, which would rank him in the top 20 at the wide receiver position, despite a rough stretch of games in recent weeks. Averages over 8.3 targets per game and faces a pass funnel Washington defense this week. We know Washington is very, very good against the run, a little bit less good against the pass. I expect the Browns to have to turn their heads towards the pass game this week if they really want to beat Washington and potentially further their momentum going into 2023. Receiver 20 for me this week is Devontae Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. 6.5-point home favorites versus New Orleans. 42 set over 98% of the time in this game. And Devontae Smith, if you had him last week, he won New Year's semifinal and is a clear wide receiver 2, in my opinion, each and every week. And he has a potential high-scoring environment this week. If the Eagles win, they can clinch the number 1 seed in the NFC. I do expect Smith to be a big reason why. The reason why he's at 20 as opposed to maybe being in my top 15 is that I'm a bit worried that people will completely project him off of last week's blow-up, which is, of course, a nice ceiling to have. But I really am curious to see how Goddard's involvement does come. The week removed from his shoulder injury, only 3 targets last week. When we saw him earlier in this year, when he was peaking, we saw him more so in that 8 to 10 range, which clearly affects Devontae Smith if you're having another tertiary offensive target in that team. But now we get on to the wide receiver 2-3 types, and I am going to try to speed run through this. Wide receiver 21, Mike Evans, already mentioned the matchup information for Tampa Bay against Carolina, but he historically dominates the Panthers, who once again rep a very beatable pass defense, like I mentioned with Chris Godwin. He just simply has not been efficient at all since week 8. I think he has the high ceiling of this entire wide receiver 2-3 group, but until he plays better, it's really hard to trust him as anything more than a back end wide receiver 2. Again, ceiling is there, but the floor that he's displayed simply is inadequate compared to some of the other games in this area. Wide receiver 22, Brandon Ayuk of the San Francisco 49ers, 9.5-point home favorites versus Las Vegas. Efficiency is never the question that I have with Brandon Ayuk. He's been one of the most efficient wide receivers in the NFL since he's entered the league. But the problem that I have is the expected volume uptick we expected with Debo out simply has not materialized. 18 targets in his last 3 games, including the Tampa Bay game where Debo got hurt. He's really just taken a backseat to George Kittle and Christian McCaffrey in this offense. However, as we know, the peripherals are still there. 95% of the snaps on an offense that has performed extremely well with Brock Purdy at the helm, and now faces a top 8 matchup against opposing wide receivers this week in Vegas, who really looks like they're just all but packing it in this year after being eliminated from the playoffs, benching longtime quarterback Derek Carr. I think that this is a pristine matchup. I do think that Brandon Ayuk is a very talented player, but I just have to see him get back on track before he's in that wide receiver 2 area. Receiver 23 is Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons, 3-point home favorites against Arizona, like I mentioned earlier. And when it comes to Drake London, the volume is just so good. 32 targets in his last 3 games, despite only 27.19 pass attempts per game from his quarterbacks in that stretch, which if you guys equate that, 32 targets, 83 total passing attempts in that area, 38.6% target share in Drake London's last 3 games. Absolutely ridiculous number, especially for a young, talented rookie wide receiver. The volume has clearly been there, and the peripherals, as I mentioned, of course, are there. But I am worried that this is a Tyler Algier game script against a run funnel Cardinals defense for a Falcons team that simply wants to establish the hell out of the run. However, as I mentioned, he's still a young, exciting rookie commanding a ridiculous volume rate that he currently is. He deserves love inside of my top 24, and maybe even top 24 might be a little bit too low given the peripherals at hand for Drake London. Receiver 24 is Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars, 4-point road favorites against the Houston Texans this week. 43.5 set over 90% of the time. And this is another run funnel defense with the Houston Texans. We all know by now that the way the teams have beat Houston this year has been through their running attacks. However, Christian Kirk is the clear wide receiver 1 for an ascending Jaguars pass game. And given the play of Trevor Lawrence, still holds incredible upside each and every week. But I am a little bit worried about the potential playoff implications for the Jacksonville Jaguars this week in a meaningless game for them. Kirk's target volume alone makes him a wide receiver 2-3 archetype, in my opinion. Wide receiver 25, Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts, 5.5-point road underdogs against the Giants this week, 39 over 68% of the time. And it's pretty simple why I do have Pittman here. Obviously, he hasn't played well. Nick Foles is a mess, but this is still a very favorable matchup against a Giants D that simply cannot stop opposing passing attacks for the clear number 1 in the Colts offense with Michael Pittman. I expect him to get back on track after that down week he had last week against the Los Angeles Chargers, and for him to return to that form that he showed going over in Minnesota, where he had 14 targets, 10 receptions, 60 yards, very consistent piece of this offense. Not a ton of scoring equity here given the implied total of the Colts, but I do think he could be a potential target magnet in this game. Receiver 26, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. Already mentioned the betting information with Amari Cooper. And we know that Terry is way more talented than wide receiver 26 would suggest, but I am concerned about his usage from Carson Wentz when Carson Wentz starts. In games where Carson Wentz has started, Terry McLaurin only averages 12 PPR points per game versus 15.34 PPR points per game when Carson Wentz is not the starter, as well as only 6 targets per game for Wentz when he starts versus 8.38 targets per game without Wentz in the starting lineup, despite running a higher passing volume with Wentz in the lineup versus when they are without Carson Wentz. So it's very clear that when Carson Wentz starts, he looks towards all the wide receivers in this offense. A nice little boost for Curtis Samuel, a nice little boost for Jahan Dotson, whereas Taylor Heineke usually just zones in on Terry McLaurin, makes sure he feeds him the ball on a week-to-week basis. We even saw this past week when Carson Wentz took over for Tyler Heineke, he threw 16 passes, only one of those times, only one target towards Terry McLaurin. So it's very clear here that Carson Wentz prefers to spread the ball out as opposed to just zone in on one wide receiver. Not to mention, we combine that with a huge run funnel matchup against the worst run D in the entire NFL with the Cleveland Browns. I genuinely have huge concerns about Terry McLaurin's potential volume this week going up against Cleveland. Again, run dominant game script, spreading the ball around from Carson Wentz, not where I usually would rank Terry McLaurin, but where I have to this week given the concerns. Receiver 27, Allen Lazard of the Green Bay Packers, 3.5-point home favorites versus Minnesota, 48 over under 51% of the time. And this is an extremely favorable matchup for Allen Lazard this week. plays the div rival Vikings, must-win climate for Green Bay. Aaron Rodgers, as we know, zones in on his wide receiver one when he trusts him quite enough. And Christian Watson potentially missing this game is going to affect Allen Lazard a ton. As we know, the Packers need to win out to make the playoffs. Aaron Rodgers is going to go with the guys he trusts, and he clearly trusts Allen Lazard. 11 targets this past week when Christian Watson went out, and typically has more success with Watson out of the lineup versus with Watson in the lineup. So I do expect Allen Lazard to return as a wide receiver 2-3 type, potentially with a high ceiling this week if Aaron Rodgers and that passing attack can get going against the Vikings in this high over-under climate. Receiver 28, Gabe Davis of the Buffalo Bills, and he's been extremely disappointing since week 11, but we will always have him in this tier due to the extreme upside he has any given week. Tethered to the right arm of Josh Allen, as we know, great game environment. Yes, he is risky, but he does have the upside to win you your fantasy chip. He's not for the faint of heart. If you are worried about Gabe Davis, if you're worried about the floor here, Gabe Davis is probably not your guy. But if you're trying to win the championship, if you could put him in as your flex and have ultimately, a 20, 25 PPR point ceiling, Gabe Davis would be your guy in that circumstance. However, I got to give you the warning. He's risky as fuck. Receiver 29, Marquise Brown of the Arizona Cardinals. And as I mentioned with DeAndre Hopkins, it's the same quarterback, the same offensive concerns, but Brown simply has not been the same player as he was earlier in this year since he returned from injury. 30 targets in those 4 games in a favorable matchup against Atlanta make him a prime bounce back candidate, in my opinion, even if he doesn't have an elite ceiling in this situation, like I mentioned. And finally, wide receiver 30, my final wide receiver in this rankings video is going to be Deontay Johnson of the Pittsburgh Steelers. 2.5-point road underdogs against Baltimore this week. 35 over-under 82% of the time. And Deontay Johnson, as we know, is a clear target magnet. 8.7 targets per game and has quietly been much better in terms of overall fantasy production this past month. I get it. He enters this game with a questionable tag, which is a bit startling, but I do think he should play with that toe injury he's been dealing with. However, the game environment absolutely sucks. Low over-under, low implied Steelers game total suggests that this game is going to be an absolute slugfest between these AFC North teams. Still, targets, Steelers fighting for their playoff lives. I do think give them a solid 4. They need to get the ball into their best playmakers' hands, which I do think Deontay Johnson is for this offense. I appreciate you guys for sticking around. And of course, if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. Also, comment down below your biggest start-sit questions like I mentioned at the beginning of the video. But until then, good luck in your matchups. Hopefully you do win your fantasy championships. Hopefully, you guys are coming to live streams, gloating about it, commenting on videos, gloating about it, all of that fun stuff. Just celebrate the moment, man. If you made your fantasy championship, already a huge accomplishment in its own right. But now it's time to win that baby. Now it's time to take that championship home. And hopefully this advice today helps you do so. Take care.
Wire me the money.